This video is going to be an introduction into fish diversity and then vertebrates in general. Most of Earth's history passed without any fish whatsoever, and so the oceans were full of life, but that was primarily bacteria, algae, and then later more primitive animals such as worms, sponges, cnidarians. Fish and thus vertebrates are only known for about the past 540 million years or so. The first fish were the most primitive. We could argue whether some of them were actually even vertebrates, but if they were, they only had tiny little pieces of cartilage in their vertebral column. The earliest ones lacked jaws, they lacked pectoral and pelvic fins, and they lacked bone tissue. Bone would come later. Now, this is worth mentioning just because vertebrate complexity developed in stages. And there are some fish alive today which are descended from these earlier fish and thus are more primitive. So hagfish, which are alive today, and we could argue whether or not they should actually be considered vertebrates. And lampreys, these are the jawless fish. They are descended from the first jawless fish. Later jawless fish, after these lineages diverged, did become more complex because for tens of millions of years, there were jawless fish, but no other kinds of fish. And so some of these jawless fish then evolved bone tissue, including, heavy bony shields protecting the head. Some had pectoral fins, which are important because later vertebrates would then possess arms in this region. Thus, as we classify living things, just as there are different groups of, say, animals, there are metazoan animals, there are animals which are bilaterally symmetrical, etc. Then there are different groups of vertebrates. So the vertebrates are considered a subphylum of the phylum Chordata. And so lancelets are chordates. They are part of the phylum Chordata, but vertebrates are part of the subphylum. We could argue whether hagfish should be considered vertebrates or not, and there's a bit of discrepancy between some genetic and physiological data, but lampreys are considered to be primitive vertebrate fish. Now, the skeletal system clearly varies. Lampreys do not have any bone whatsoever, and they have little pieces of cartilage along their spinal cord, above their spinal cord, and then also above their notochord. So it is the notochord, which is the primary support rod for the earliest vertebrates, although cartilage would start to play a role as well. There's also cartilage around the gills and a few cartilage plates in the head region. But as I had said, since they don't have bone, then they are far more primitive than the vertebrates which would come. Now, the cartilage around the gill arches, that then becomes significant because the cartilages which were in the first two gill arches were later modified to become jaws. And so then within the group of vertebrates, there is the subgroup of jawed vertebrates or gnathostomes. But before getting into that, it's just worth mentioning that there are a diversity of fish alive today. And in addition to mentioning fish in general, I would like to focus on fish in the northeastern United States, just to get some idea of the diversity here. Most of the fish of the northeastern United States are bony fish, and they certainly have jaws, but the lamprey does occur here. It isn't native to this area. It was introduced, perhaps there were ships coming from another part of the world that took on seawater in one part of the the world, and then released it, perhaps in the Great Lakes when they delivered their, whatever their cargo was. But lampreys such as this one then were introduced and are found in this area. Now, while some lampreys can actually be free living, the typical lampreys are parasites, where they will lodge onto other fish and then make a hole with their mouths and then suck out body fluids. And so therefore, these are parasites on other fish. And they have contributed to the reducing populations and even some extinctions of fish, such as some trout relatives in the Great Lakes. Here is a larval lamprey. These are, once again, jawless fish. They have mouths, but they do not have jaws. And the notochord is the primary support rod, showing that they are very primitive vertebrates. Tens of millions of years after the first fish, once again, which were jawless fish, the gill arches were modified so that the first two then became more mobile. And this then became the jaws of the jawed fish. And the jawed vertebrates share features, and therefore we call them gnathostomes. So they are a subgroup of the vertebrates. Not only do they share jaws, they have both pectoral and pelvic fins. Now that's important, because the tetrapods will convert pectoral fins to arms and pelvic fins to legs. So, that's certainly significant. But we also see many other things which are shared, whether it be, say, in the cerebellum of the brain or in the production of antibodies in the immune system, that the jawed vertebrates share features that the jawless fish lack. And so the jawed fishes form a group, and the cartilaginous sharks, rays, and skates, they would be representatives of early groups of jawed fishes alive today. There are a few which can occur in freshwater, but none in the Northeast United States, although, say, the Caribbean, if one were to go scuba diving there, is a great place to observe sharks such as the nurse shark here and the reef shark in the next video. Now, while introducing the diversity of fish alive today, certainly it is relevant to mention that many of these populations are declining, and we worry about species which are, going to be endangered and then maybe even approaching extinction. Certainly, overfishing is a major threat to shark populations. In fact, some of the overfishing for sharks is for fins, which then get put into soups, so that after a shark is caught, most of the body of the shark is sometimes actually just discarded and only the fins kept, which obviously is a horrible waste. And this is occurring to such a degree that shark populations for most species are declining. And certainly the effects of climate change on coral reefs then affects their food supply as well. And so while this video is looking at diversity, certainly this could then stem into discussions of biodiversity and loss of habitat, etc. So within the chordates, that's a phylum that would include lancets, hagfish, lampreys, sharks, etc. There are vertebrates, a subphylum, and that would include certainly lampreys and arguably hagfish. And then within the subphylum of vertebrates, there would be the group of jawed vertebrates, which include sharks and everyone here in yellow, but not the jawless fish alive today. So sharks would be a primitive branch of the gnathostomes. And then all remaining fish are what we call bony fish or osteichthyans. Now, osteichthyans have two groups. One doesn't occur in our area. That would include, say, lungfish and the coelacanth. So they're not that common today. But they were certainly significant because it was from this second group the Sarcopterygian fish, that the first amphibians evolved. Now, Sarcopterygian fish, including this lungfish, they have true lungs. And so it's significant that then, this group of fish already had lungs before adapting to life on land. And if you were to consider the limbs of fossil members of the Sarcopterygian fish, unlike most fish fins, they had bones which went down the middle of the fin. And then by about 350 million years ago or so, some of these fish fins included a blue bone, which is the homologue of the humerus. Then two bones in the next section of the fin, which are homologues of the radius and ulna, and then homologues of additional bones, even in a wrist joint, and similar structures in the leg. And so the bones which amphibians have in their arms and legs were actually adaptations of the bones which the Sarcopterygian fish had in their fins to begin with. So these Sarcopterygian fish, they are certainly of interest if one wanted to talk about the evolution of amphibians. But the majority of the fish alive today are not the Sarcopterygian fish, which have, say, this bone that goes down the middle of their fin, and the muscles that move the fin are actually within the fin, but rather the ray fin fish, also known as the Actinopterygian fish, which have cartilage rays in the fins. Now, I'll get back to just osteichthyans in general in a second, but of the ray-finned fish, the first groups to appear are not the most common fish alive today. So when we think of a fish, if it's not a shark, we're probably thinking of a type of ray-finned fish called a teleost fish. So teleosts, they are the most common bony fish alive today. There aren't that many lungfish, coelacanths. And then there are also a couple of ray-finned fish lineages which are more primitive than the teleosts, such as sturgeons, like this one, gars, bowfin, and a few others. One of the things that you would recognize is if you looked at their scales, they're white and they're hard. They actually have enamel. The same material that is in your teeth is actually in their scales. So here is a gar, and then here is the skeleton of a bowfin. So and the bowfins have their name because they have this elongate fin that goes down their backs. Bowfin do occur in the Northeast United States. So of the osteichthyan fish, there are a number of primitive lineages. You can find, say, bowfin in the Delaware. You can find sturgeon in the Hudson River. And so some of these primitive lineages are represented here. In the family tree of living things, once again, lungfish would form a group with the amphibians. So lungfish are more closely related to the amphibians than are, say, bass or trout, etc. Because, they have true lungs, they have and some others in the fossil record had bones in the fins homologous. But all osteichthyans are more closely related to the vertebrates on land than, say, sharks are related to those vertebrates on land. And one, if you were to look at the skull of, in this case, that bowfin, one were to see bones that I have. I have a parietal bone, so does the bowfin. I have lacrimal bones. I have a maxillary bone, so does the bowfin. A bowfin has a premaxillary bone, and I had one as an embryo, even if I don't have it now. And so when we look at the anatomy of the bony fish, it's clear that fish form groups, and that the bony fish are more closely related to the tetrapods. They share more traits in common than say, sharks and certainly lampreys, etc. So once again, I had said that the bony fish, or actinopterygians, they form the majority of fish alive today. And then one of the things that one could consider is the diversity of fish. Now, I have two playlists which, kind of hint at this enormous diversity. It is enormous. There are more species of bony fish than there are birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians combined. All right, so when we think of the vertebrates, fish, primarily the bony fish, they make up half of the diversity of vertebrates alive today. So I have two playlists that try to hint at this. Obviously, in this cursory introduction, the diversity of fish is simply too much to cover here. But just, I'd like to mention a number of fish and then point out a couple of interesting traits along the way. So first off, American eels are a type of fish. They are scaleless and thus can perform some gas exchange through their skin. One of the interesting things I think about these fish, and then another one, is that if, say, you're near a river in the northeastern United States, it's easy not to think of the ocean. But nevertheless, these ecosystems are linked, because this eel was not born in the Delaware River. It was born in the ocean. It migrated to the Delaware River and other places, where it then spent out, years of its life. And then later in its life, it then traveled back to the ocean, where it mated near the Sargasso Sea, died, but before dying, then laid eggs, which produce little eelings, which then migrate into fresh water once again. And so here we have a scenario where just like birds migrate, and if you're concerned about bird diversity, say in the Northeast United States, you have to think about the south of the United States and Latin America, because our summer birds spend winters there. And so, for example, if there's deforestation, in the southern United States or in Latin America, then we might have fewer birds here, and vice versa, because our species depend on multiple regions of the world to complete their lifespan. And there are other fish that then also migrate. Not only do eels migrate, but also shad migrate. And so shad are fish which in the spring then migrate away from the ocean upstream, so where they get to areas where they spawn. Many die, so that they have this exhausting journey. They then lay as many eggs as they can, they mate, and they die. They may survive and do this again, but very often they die. And then the young, over the course of the summer, then they can slowly start to go downstream and end up in the ocean. And then at a certain point, then migrate north or migrate upstream once again. So this is fascinating. It certainly involves environmental issues, because, for example, if humans put dams on rivers, as we often do, then that may prevent shad from migrating, and shad have been lost from many rivers where they originally were found. And then all sorts of environmental, impacts, in that, for example, these shad runs are very important. And so the Delaware River is able to host, this great population of bald eagles. And one of the reasons is that as the young bald eagles are hatching, the adults are feeding fish to them. And many of them are the shad which die or are dying after spawning. So not only are shad runs important for fisher men and women, including going back to colonial America, the shad runs were very important. They're important for wildlife as well. But once again, a complexity. Not only do birds migrate, but some fish migrate as well. And so thus we need to consider the different habitats that they go to. Now, if we were to look at the bony fish, we could then break them into smaller and smaller groups. There are orders, there are families, there are genera within families. And so some of these are more closely related than others. So pickerel are more closely related to pike than they are to other types of fish. And so once again, as we've gone through this diversity, one of the emphases has been on the groups and the subgroups of living things. And then we could, include the different species of pickerel, the pike, etc. And just, I'm going to mention a number of different species, and obviously these individual videos go into these in a little bit more detail. There are other groups. So there are the perch form a group, and then there are fish known as walleyes, which are more closely related to perch than they are to other types of fish. These are popular for eating, although they tend to be a bit smaller than many of the game fish. And nevertheless, perch, which often have reddish on their fins, are popular among fisher people. Now, in studying the diversity of life, probably one has reached this point by studying aquatic invertebrates prior to this. And so obviously fish are tied to that. So when fish first hatch, many of them are then feeding on plankton, whether it be algae or protists in the water. They get a little bit bigger, and now they can feed on small aquatic invertebrates, so that there are small crustaceans that they can feed on. And many insects are either aquatic as adults or aquatic as larvae. So, things like dragonflies and damselflies, they lay their eggs in the water. There's an aquatic larval stage before the larvae then mature and then become the terrestrial adults. And so aquatic habitats have plants, have algae, have protists, have crustaceans, have aquatic insects, they have small fish and large fish. And obviously then different fish can eat different food sources at different points in their life. And things like the catfish with their sensory barbels specialize at feeding at night and feeding near the bottom as they move their heads and barbs along the bottom. Then they might disturb small aquatic animals, ranging from insects to amphibians to other fish, which would then move, and then they can capture them. Some fish can reach considerable sizes as adults, but many fish can't. And so there is a group of fish, commonly referred to as the minnows. They have a number of species where, as adults, their size is rather small. Now, there are exceptions to this, as there are to everything. Just like, very often there's, a group of organisms where they're typically small, but they can be a little bit bigger. In the same way, carp are members of this group. And obviously, carp can get to be quite large, but most of the minnows are smaller. Some have common names, if they're easily recognized, such as the shiner, which has bright shiny scales. Carp are not native to this area, but were introduced. And so we could discuss when we look at fish in an area, if some of them have been introduced, are they displacing the native fish? Should there be an effort to remove the non-native fish? But then again, since many people like to fish for sport and then as a source of food, that's then another consideration. Carp are not as commonly eaten in the United States, but in other parts of the world, carp are a popular game fish, and they can get to be quite large. In the Northeast United States,
sunfish family includes sunfish, bass, and crappie.
Bass, sunfish, and a fish that kind of looks partway between the two, known as a crappie. These form a related family, and they are very popular for fishing for sport, but then also for food. Bass are the largest members of the group, but many prefer the taste of sunfish, while smaller, nevertheless have a sweet taste. There are different species of bass. There are different species of crappie and sunfish. So, for example, the bluegill here, and one can notice that that black spot on the gill cover, and the darker color is different from, say, the pumpkin seed sunfish, which is more colorful and has that red spot there. So there are different types of sunfish. There are fish which look partway between sunfish. Pause for this truck. Crappies are intermediate in size and in appearance between sunfish and bass, and the largest members of the group are the bass. Largemouth bass can reach a considerable size and are thus popular with sports fishing, and then they can be so large that they can even then include things like bullfrogs in their diet, even, say, small ducklings, small birds, and so these are top predators in aquatic ecosystems. So here you can see a large mouth bass. There is another species of bass which can occur in this area as well, the smallmouth bass. Just as on land, one can talk about food chains where, for example, there are plants and there are herbivores which eat the plants, and then there may be like primary carnivores which eat the herbivores, but then secondary carnivores can eat those. And so you can thus have a food chain. And largemouth bass in aquatic populations are, unless we consider, things like humans or bald eagles or great blue herons, they are at the tops of the food chain. Now, there are different types of aquatic habitats. And if you were to, say, go fishing in, say, more stagnant water like a swamp, one might not find bass, or certainly not trout, because these larger fish, they need more oxygen. And if you were to, say, fish in a lake, you might be more likely to, catch, bass, as opposed to if you were to fish in a river, you might be more likely to catch trout. And so just as on land, there are different types of habitats, and you're more likely to find certain organisms in habitats that they've adapted to. The same thing applies to aquatic environments. So in your area, it's not just that you have aquatic habitats, you have different kinds of aquatic habitats, which then can have different kinds of life. Now, trout are a popular type of game fish as well, and they are in the same family as salmon. In fact, they are so closely related to salmon that some trout, say one trout in the family, is more closely related to this salmon, and then another trout is more closely related to that salmon. So some trout are more closely related to some species of salmon than they are to other species of trout. There are a number of trout which occur in our area. So, for example, there are brown trout, rainbow trout, brook trout, among others. Because they are so popular in fishing, some of them have been introduced here. So brown trout were not originally native to our area. They were introduced into the United States in the 1800s. Brook trout are native, and so a number of things can be said. One is brown trout tend to be a bit more tolerant of variations in environmental quality, and including after, say, human impacts. So sometimes human impact then changes an environment, and say the native brook trout then often have trouble living. So the decline of brook trout is then, can be tied to, a change in environmental quality. Whereas brown trout are more tolerant of environmental change. Rainbow trout, which at some time of their life can have a nice pink stripe down their bodies, they are also introduced and not native to this area. They also, many fish have multiple common names, and so a rainbow trout can also be called steelheads. And then brook trout, these are native to our area, and brook trout during mating season can have bright red coloration on their undersides and fins. Now, just like salmon are known for migrating and then sometimes even like leaping up rapids, trout can do that to a degree. Trout can certainly migrate during the year where they lay their eggs, and they are capable of jumping. And so in some of these videos, you'll see, trout leaping out of the water. They are, after all, the cousins of salmon. And so that ability found in salmon is also shared to a degree in their relatives, the trout. In my classes, because I live in the Northeast of the United States, I focus on local fish biodiversity, because while I think it's wonderful to know about the biodiversity that lives elsewhere in the world, I think one should appreciate the life around you, and so I focus on that. But then one of the keys is, not only is conservation important in, say, the Northeast United States, there are fish species which are declining. There have been a few trout relatives which have become extinct from the Great Lakes. Then that would then be true of all parts of the world. And so if you were to go to other parts of the world, I have a playlist here of fish from the Caribbean, like this barracuda, one would see a completely unique set of fish. So conservation of natural resources is important in freshwater in the northeastern United States, but it would also then be important in the Caribbean. It would be important in freshwater environments in Latin America and Southeast Asia and Africa, and various reef systems are important as well. Just as certain animals then have a distribution where they're only found in certain parts of the world and in certain habitats, the same would be true of fish. Many are found only in certain parts of the world and only in certain types of habitats. One of the great risks to marine life in general is not only the overfishing, which humans do. Now that's true all over the world, where most of the great fish regions of the world have either collapsed or are in serious decline. There are, in Southeast Asia, you have an incredible concentration of the human population, and fish is a major source of protein, given how many of the countries have a coastline. So this is an environmental issue, the overfishing, which causes the extinction of many species. But then even, it gets to an economical issue. There's issues that happen between countries as, fishing boats from one country then go into, the waters of another country. So, there's even the possibility of, conflict and shots fired, on between boats from different countries over fishing rights. And so, overfishing is an issue, but then certainly is then the loss of coral reefs. Coral reefs aren't that large in terms of area. So for example, if you were to put all of the coral reefs of the world in one place, it would equal about the size of New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. Now, given the size of the ocean, that's really not that big an area. But about a quarter of all of the ocean's fish spend at least part of their life in a coral reef. And so while they aren't big in terms of area, they are incredibly important for marine ecosystems. Not only are we overfishing the fish, but there are then harmful fishing practices, which, rake nets over delicate corals and destroy them in ways that will just take, a very long time for the corals to regrow. But then also, I mean, in some places, dynamite is put in the water, or poisons are put in the water to kill the fish. But this then harms, the habitat in which they were living, making it less likely that here's an eagle ray, that the fish, that the coral reef can support fish in the future. And so as we consider the diversity of life on Earth, marine fish, well, all fish, but certainly marine fish, are important in this. Once again, there are more species of fish than there are of all terrestrial environments. They're about balanced, and certainly with the effect of human impact on the world, the overfishing, the damage to coral reefs from climate change, from the acidification of the oceans as more carbon dioxide enters the water, making it more acidic and thus harder for coral organisms to make the corallite of the actual reef, and a host of other things. These marine ecosystems are threatened. That not only threatens the biodiversity of our planet, but humans depend so much on this marine life as sources of protein. But then also, many islands and coasts, ecotourism is a major source of income, for people who go scuba diving, like myself, to get these images. And so the loss of coral reefs then threatens many organisms. So because there are so many different kinds of fish, this was simply meant to introduce the major groups to fish and kind of explain how the groups are then linked to vertebrates in general, but then also to introduce just the idea of biodiversity. And so here in my Caribbean fish and marine life playlist, clearly you can see that there's a number of different kinds of Caribbean fish, not even, and with some different types of corals and the like. And so if you wanted to pursue this this further, by all means, feel free to see individual videos here. But once again, the purpose was to introduce just the great diversity of fish, not only throughout the world, such as here in the Caribbean, but also then locally. And so you might want to consider the fish that live in your area and get to know them better. And then as we discuss environmental issues, certainly the many environmental issues affect fish diversity and the coral reefs on which they depend.